and got it, but if you're driving the ship. Okay, project report.
Right, I think my my clock has ticked over, so 9:30. I think we'll make a start. So I declare the council meeting AR 22/1 open and welcome everyone present. I have an apology from Councillor or Deputy Mayor Scrimger, and I haven't seen Alan Sol, Kevin Marsh, or Margaret Murray-Benge on yet. Are any of those on?
Yeah, Alan's on.
Alan's on. Okay, yeah. So, but still an apology from Kevin Marsh and Margaret Murray-Benge. I call for a mover and seconder to accept the apologies. Councillor Dean and Councillor Thwaites. Thank you very much. All in favour, say aye.
Aye.
Carried. As before we get going, probably I just wanted to reiterate some of the Zoom meeting protocols. So this is being live streamed, so be careful what you say. Please raise your hand when you want to speak. Stay unmuted when not speaking. And staff have just asked me to remind you that you need to stay on video to be officially present. Okay, so no switching off and walking out. Thank you. Okay, so moving on. There's no consideration of late items. Any declarations of interest? I can't see any. I have an item in the confidential agenda, which I'll cover later. There are no public excluded items. I'm not aware of anyone here for public forum. No. So we'll move to page 7, the Bangor Treasury update and presentation, where we look forward to hearing from Ross Woodfield and Suresh Ranchod. I think David, you're gonna kick this one off.
Sure. So, morning, Chair Jones. Good morning, elected members. So Bancorp are our Treasury partner. They are our appointed advisors on all Treasury matters. I've invited them along this morning to give a brief update on their views for inflation and interest rates and how we've positioned ourselves as a council to deal with those risks. So we have Ross and Suresh online with us this morning. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'll pass over to them to, I'm assuming Ross or Suresh, will one of you share your screen?
Yep, I can do that. Thank you very, very much, everyone. Appreciate your time. And yeah, as David said, we're your Treasury partner. So we've been working with David for a couple of years now, and we'll give a very brief. We'll try and keep it as brief as possible, but yeah, very brief view of what we're seeing in terms of inflation. So just to kick off, inflation is certainly a global story at the moment. You can see here these are CPIs for various different countries around the world, New Zealand included, going back a number of years. And you can see it's since the pandemic, it's been a global phenomenon that we've seen inflation climbing well above most countries' target levels. So New Zealand's not alone at all, up there at 5.9%. One of the key drivers is energy prices, and oil prices have spiked, obviously, since Russia invaded the Ukraine, but certainly it's a trend that started with oil basically falling to zero during the start of the pandemic, and then pretty substantially climbing from those levels over the last 2 years. So you've got CPI is measured year on year, so obviously it takes into account what oil prices were a year ago. So they're certainly well up on where they were a year ago, nearly double what they were. So obviously that's going to be a pretty big component of inflation. And as I said, Russia and Ukraine tensions have caused that to spike again. It's also seen a large spike in a number of other commodities, particularly wheat, which is going to feed into global food costs around the world. And you can see there, obviously oil has come off its highs, which hopefully we'll see feed through to the petrol pump, but I don't hold out too much hope just yet. Also, the other one there is the global dairy trade, which is up about 18% from a year ago. Since the start of December last year. So that's obviously feeding into local food prices, milk and cheese and that sort of thing. And the other biggest driver of inflation generally has been supply chain issues around the world. So we've seen here, this is an index measuring supply chain pressures in the US, and that's spiked to levels that haven't been seen in 20 odd years. And then even domestically, this is the number of trucks and light traffic on the roads, and obviously you can see the pandemic lows, but the number of trucks is down, and that's just a reflection of things like congestion at ports and shipping delays and that sort of thing. So all of that feeds into just higher costs generally for a lot of products that New Zealand imports. Suresh, do you want to add anything at this point?
No, please carry on, Ross. Yep.
Okay. This is an interesting one. This looks at tradable and non-tradable, and tradable is anything we import, non-tradable is anything domestically produced or that's not affected by our overseas competitors or trading counterparties. And you can see here, non-tradable inflation has been high for a number of years. It's been sitting at the top end of that band, but we've been what you'd term importing deflation or importing low inflation. So, consumer electronics, obviously the oil price was reasonably low throughout these years. So domestic driven inflation has been relatively high over these years, but the headline number was being dragged down by, efficiency gains around the world in terms of technology and manufacturing and that sort of thing. So that headline number was sitting comfortably within the RBNZ's target band. And in fact, at some points it was uncomfortably low. That's why we've seen a downward trajectory in interest rates over the last pretty much since the GFC, really. And so that's pretty much got us to where we are now. And the RBNZ's been potentially caught out a little bit with just how high and how fast inflation has spiked. But you can see here, it's not just a global story. There is domestically driven inflation. And this
just one other thing, sorry, Ross.
Yep.
On that non-tradable side, that encompasses a lot of things like utilities, electricity, power, gas, and of course council rates, which we all know sort of had upward kind of pressure anyway across the sector. So that's one of the reasons why inflation, didn't completely sink away, is that, we had upward momentum in those sort of sectors.
Yeah, another driver of non-tradables inflation has been that rise in the minimum wage, or the general cost of wages rising. So that's obviously feeding through to domestically produced goods and services. I see a couple of hands up there. Does anyone want to ask a question at this point?
Councillor Granger.
Yeah, does the increase in rentals, does that go into the non-tradable as well, does it?
Yeah, that's in there as well, yep.
And Councillor Murray-Bench.
Does the amount of borrowing have any impact on the inflation movement?
That's a good question. I would say yes.
Really, you could say housing is obviously a component in there. So rises in house prices when borrowing has obviously been impacting that. We've got some charts a bit later on that will show you that. But yeah, that would help. Certainly the rise in the housing market, which has been led by debt. And it's largely households that have been the net borrower over the last 2 years. In fact, I think certainly in the last 12 months, mortgage debt's gone up by around 53 billion, where business and agri debt, and that would include the council, has only grown by about 1.5 billion. So you could argue too, that housing's in there and debt.
So,
Yeah.
but my question is, the amount of money that the government is borrowing, how is that impacted on our inflation rate, as well as housing? I do understand that one.
Yeah, the amount that the government's borrowed probably has, although it's been a bit of a unique situation with the government borrowing to kind of fill people's wages, keep that wage subsidy, keep people in jobs and that sort of thing. So we might have seen inflation plummet had the government not borrowed that. But I think Suresh is right. A bigger driver is probably that household borrowing, which fuels spending, fuels demand. So low interest rates has probably led to a higher inflation rate now because people borrow and spend, which creates demand.
Thank you.
Okay. This second chart here is also really important for the RBNZ. They look at what people expect inflation to be in a year, one year, 2 years, and 10 years. And you can see over the past, that 2-year inflation, which is kind of their key benchmark, has been around that 2%, which is where they're happy with it. If people expect inflation to be 2%, then inflation is going to be 2%. Whereas now we've seen, particularly that 1 year and also the 2-year inflation expectations get dragged really high and uncomfortably high for the RBNZ, which is why they're looking at hiking rates quite aggressively. It's more of they're trying to signal to the market and to consumers that inflation is going to come down back into the target range via higher interest rates. Here's some different components of inflation. I won't go through all of the details, but you can see here, this is the December number data, which is the latest we have. It'll probably look slightly different for the March quarter, but you can see here foods, housing and household utilities, and transport, some of the biggest, or the three biggest components. Housing and things like the cost of construction, that's obviously driven by, global factors, these supply chain issues I was talking about. Also the cost of building materials globally has been quite high. So that's obviously meant that we're paying more to build a house. Transport is certainly driven by the price of oil, and food, is a seasonal thing, but also has global demand elements to it. And you can see a communication, that's a negative component of inflation that reflects obviously the efficiencies in technology and the cost of things like mobile phones coming down. And as Suresh alluded to, we had some charts. These charts show, this one here shows local authority rates, and you can see they've been consistently around 4% for the last number of years, and that's helped that non-tradables inflation remain relatively high. And you can see, the last couple of years, obviously councils around the country have implemented some rate increases to shore up the books, and that's it is what it is. It's helping to just lift that overall inflation rate, but it's not the only thing. Obviously, property servicing and maintenance, that's higher than it has been, but again, that's been relatively high for a number of years. Housing rentals, rent prices are increasing. That's obviously a reflection of
House prices.
Increase in house prices themselves. Yeah, thank you, Suresh. And this is an interesting chart. The cost of living for all households in New Zealand, you can see here pretty consistently around that 2% until the last couple of years when pretty much everything now costs more. So what's the RBNZ doing about it? They've been signalling pretty aggressive rate hikes, and you can see this dashed line is what the market is predicting the 90-day floating rate to do, which is obviously quite closely tied to the OCR. And the RBNZ's own predictions for or projections, sorry, for the OCR are shown here as these three lines going back through August, November, and the latest one in February. So as that inflation rate has, just continued to increase up to where it is now, nearly at 6%, the RBNZ has become more and more aggressive on interest rates. So the market and the RBNZ are now suggesting that the OCR is going to go pretty well over 3%, potentially up to 3.5%, which we think is going to cause a lot of pain for a lot of households, and particularly at a time when they're getting squeezed through a lot of cost pressures elsewhere. So just conscious of time, but I'll just whip through the last couple of slides. This is swap rates. So the council obviously borrows on either on a fixed or floating basis. When it borrows floating, it can overlay interest rate swaps to fix those floating rates to a fixed rate. And you can see here, the last couple of years have seen interest rates drive higher as that expectation for rate hikes has fed through from the RBNZ, and they've continued on, but they're getting very squeezed up around that 3%. And what we find interesting about this chart is going back to 2014, 2015, when the last time we saw an OCR above 3%, the RBNZ managed to do 4 interest rate hikes from 2.5 to 3.5, and then global inflation as well as domestic inflation turned on a dime. It fell quite rapidly. If anyone remembers, 2015 was around that Euro crisis, and eventually the RBNZ ended up cutting to a lower rate than we had seen before that hiking cycle. And what's interesting about this period is lending to households was around 200 billion.
Yes.
And it's currently nearly 340 billion.
Yep.
Suresh, am I right?
Yep. So we've seen nearly a 70% increase in mortgage debt over that 7-year period. And the point is here that the market and the Reserve Bank are implying that we'll take the cash rate back to that time when mortgage debt was 68, has grown 68%. So that's where we see quite significant risk.
Yeah, where the average household is certainly going to feel the pain of a 3.5% cash rate. That's going to put mortgage rates up at 5.5% to 6%, and certainly the average mortgage, was a fraction of what it was, what it is now, back in 2014, 2015, when we saw the cash rate last at those levels. And this chart's interesting. This shows what the RBNZ thinks the neutral OCR is, and neutral just means it's not stimulating nor contracting the economy. So it would be, the economy ticking along itself with an interest rate or a cash rate that's not restricting or trying to stimulate growth. And the RBNZ have it now around about 2%, a little bit under 2%, with potentially as low as sub 1% and as high as just a fraction over 3%. So somewhere in that range. And the RBNZ's obviously now predicting the OCR to go outside the top of this range, up to nearly 3.5%, which would be a significant constriction on the economy. That cash rate would definitely put the brakes on.
Sorry, just one thing from me on this chart, that particularly since the GFC, there has only been one attempt to get the OCR back towards the neutral range, and that pretty much stalled back in 2014-15. And if you look at this, since the GFC, we have spent more time under neutral and certainly outside the range of neutral options than we have in it. And for the Reserve Bank to take us above these expectations is aggressive.
Yeah, and this is one chart we like. These are if you think back to that chart I showed you with the projections for the OCR from the RBNZ. The RBNZ is notoriously poor at forecasting its own OCR, and you can see here going back following the GFC, it was projecting a series of aggressive rate hikes, and it only managed a 50-point hike. And then again in 14-15, that period we've been talking about, they were looking at taking the cash rate back over 5%, and obviously couldn't manage that, and subsequently cut down to aggressively low levels, and now, again, big hikes. But, the question is, will they be able to deliver? And the track record suggests perhaps not. I see another hand up. Is there a question?
Councillor Murray-Benj.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's the inflation issue was identified a few months ago as nothing but theft, and for the Reserve Bank to try and control it, does that not mean that they will bring inflation down, which will have less impact on our standard of living? Whereas if it is allowed to stay as high as it is, we're just slipping backwards, are we not?
Yes, absolutely. There's no question that the RBNZ has to act to try and rein in inflation. The problem is that what we saw around the world in response to the pandemic was an enormous amount of money being pumped into the system. And now we're seeing the result of that as higher inflation. You've also got a number of unfortunate factors that are confluencing at the same time, these supply chain issues which haven't really gone away, and oil prices, and obviously a war in Ukraine, just for good measure. So in terms of what the RBNZ has to do, they have to try and get it back, get inflation to come down. But a lot of these factors are, what a number of central banks have termed transitory. It's just the problem is that these transitory factors have lasted a lot longer than anyone expected. So at some point, inflation will come down because the world cannot sustain oil up at $100, $120 a barrel without economic growth being restricted. It's high oil prices is essentially a tax on the global economy. So at some point, these factors will come down. But the RBNZ being very aggressive with these rate hikes pretty much suggests that they're going to they're going to do more than they need to, and some of these factors they can't control. So the factors they can control, they're going to obviously bring inflation down with. But there's a lot of factors they can't control, which if those two things happen at the same time, we could very well be in a situation where inflation is back to zero or even potentially negative, given how high it is at the moment.
Ross, I'd like to ask a follow-up, if I may, saying,
Sure.
Is inflation still forecast to subside quickly or linger at higher levels?
Yeah, no, it is projected to. The RBNZ themselves have projected inflation to fall back to about, I think,
2%, correct?
Yeah.
2%. But the reason, sorry if I may, the reason the Reserve Bank is always picking inflation, will always pick inflation, to go back to the midpoint between 1 and 3, which is 2, because they will drive that. So if we don't have inflation, they'll be cutting rates. If we have too much inflation, they're going to be hiking rates, which will dampen demand. So whatever way the market looks at it, they always assume that we'll head back to 2. It's just, we should have got there on our own merits, but this, oil prices, commodity, supply chain issues have just lasted a lot longer than expected, and therefore now we've got this hiking cycle that will dampen demand.
Okay, thank you. Carry on, Ross.
Okay, that's actually all from us. So yeah, in terms of,
I just want to say one thing just for me. If you just go back to that last chart where Ross, it's we've never not seen such an aggressive hiking cycle, certainly in a lot of our times. We'd have to go back to pre-GFC 2006-7 when, house prices were way lower and easier to manage. So what the Reserve Bank is trying to do is an extremely difficult job, I think, and it's what they're using the OCR as a very blunt tool. And it's a big axe, and there will be some damage that comes from a tightening cycle that they are implying if they can deliver it. But I suspect, and what they're saying is they are hiking at every meeting until next year. And they only have to falter once for the market to get a hint that things aren't playing out. And so that's the biggest risk, that they will under-deliver.
Councillor Daly.
Yeah, look, I'm just, there's a sort of this problem of the high mortgage rates and the high borrowing and a political politicians not wanting to impose too much pain on the homeowners, and this sort of causes a natural break on raising the OCR. I think it's got a term, and I think the mayor knows all about it. It's sort of, there's a Japanese example, long-running Japanese example. But are we in that position in New Zealand now?
Do you mean stagflation, Councillor Daly?
Well, just the fact that you can't impose too much pain by keep putting the interest rates up. So you just, and you said an attempt was made in 2014 to raise the OCR back to the neutral zone, but it wasn't sustainable.
Yeah, we think
Pop
these.
back that
Sorry.
chart, Ross. Sorry.
Which one?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we the amount of hikes that they're potentially going to do is going to have a far bigger impact now, given how much mortgage debt is out there, than it would have had, in days gone by. So these 2% of hikes, 2.5% of hikes that they're suggesting doing, is equal to, say, 4% of hikes, 5 years ago. So I think the amount of hikes is extremely aggressive and will have a huge impact.
Yeah.
Mayor Webber.
Thanks, Ross and Suresh. An interesting presentation. But given the historical correlation between high oil prices and the corresponding high trend in dairy prices, do you think, given the New Zealand economy, one will, the expenditure on oil is going to go up, but the income on dairy tends to go up? Does that smooth things a little bit for New Zealand? Thank you.
Yeah, to some extent, yes. But at the moment, what we're seeing is dairies aren't as profitable as they were the last time the dairy payout was above $8 a kg. So the cost of fertilizer, for example, is extremely high at the moment. It's 3 or 4 times higher than it was back then. So those farm inputs, the farmers, they might be making money on one side of the ledger, but they're certainly paying it out on the other side of the ledger, in terms of fertilizer costs, fuel costs, wages, that sort of thing. So no, I don't think the dairy income will entirely offset the oil price.
And if you look at New Zealand too, on a broader scale, we're down 17 billion in our tourism sector. So we're missing that, which is going to be slow to come back on tap. The education sector has also been hit with foreign students, which is still dragging. Bancorp advises a lot in all those sectors. So we're still seeing pain there. And really the key driver for the New Zealand economy since the pandemic hit has been the domestic side, and it's largely driven by the wealth effect from the housing boom. Now that's about to quickly unwind. So that's what worries us. The domestic economy will slow hard. I think dairy is going to continue to do okay, same as the meat sector and the fruit sector. And, they'll make good profits. But overall, we think, we're more on a negative slant than we certainly are on the positive that you see from dairy and say kiwi fruit in your region.
Right, thank you.
Councillor Granger.
Thanks. Some of us around the table remember the 70s and 80s when mortgages were 26% and inflation had various peaks up to 20%. We survived. It wasn't great, pretty painful at the time. And what's the big difference now when people are worrying about it creeping up from 2 to 4? Is it because of the quantitative easing that's happened that's different, or why is the dynamic so very different this time around compared to the 70s and 80s when we had the oil price shocks then and massive inflation and massive mortgages?
Debt is by far the biggest difference. The average household is saddled with vast amounts of debt. Governments around the world, saddled with debt. Obviously, councils probably far more debt than they had back then. So a rise in interest rates is going to be felt across the spectrum, and it's going to end up as a huge drag on growth, because suddenly you're taking so much money out of the economy to service all of that debt that probably wasn't budgeted for, when the debt was taken out.
And if I may add here, I think in this, the problem we have now is that New Zealand is one of the most overpriced housing markets in the world, and the debt to income ratios are so high. People are going up 12, 13, where I think in the 70s, people borrowed only 3 or 4, if I remember correctly. I think my dad paid his mortgage off over 4 or 5 years. And the multiples were much lower. You only went, I think, 3 or 4 in the 60s and 70s when you bought a house. So I think that would be a key difference.
Thank you. Councillor Murray Benj, I'm just conscious of time here, so let's keep this one brief, please.
Beg your pardon?
Your question, Margaret Murray Benj, but I'm just conscious of time here, so I'll ask you to keep it brief.
Could I just please ask, has the amount of money that's been floating around, and But just follow on from the last speaker and the sensible things he was saying about the housing market. Why did we have so much cheap money floating around the world that seemed as though it would forever be cheap? Can someone answer that one?
Yeah, I think the central banks, global central banks, have got a lot to answer for. I've heard a term that we're not allowed recessions anymore. I think that's one of Suresh's terms, actually. So, at the slightest sign of economic pain over the last 2 decades, these central banks have thrown money at them, and obviously one of the biggest tools that we saw used in the pandemic was quantitative easing. And the Fed, for example, printed nearly $6 trillion, whereas following the GFC, their balance sheet went from $500 billion to $3 trillion. So much money has been put into the system. And you're absolutely right. That all that money has just ended up in asset prices rather than stimulating the growth that they would have hoped to stimulate. So that's got us into a situation now where we've got extremely high asset prices fueled by all of that cheap money. And the problem is you can't just quickly take that money away, that cheap money away, because you crash asset prices, which crashes the economy. People don't go out and spend money if their house has gone back 50%. So yeah, we're in a bit of a trap that could take years and years to get out of, and it's going to rely on wage growth to be able to service that debt that's now embedded.
Thank you, Ross. I think we moved to the end of this section now, so I'll thank you and Suresh for a very informative presentation. It's been great to hear from you. So I have 2 recommendations. I'll call for a mover and a seconder, please. I see Councillor Granger and Councillor Daly. Let's go with that. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. So now we move on to page 8 and the Aon Insurance update presentation from Matthew and Deanna.
Apologies, I was having issues trying to get my camera to work. Hello, everybody.
Welcome.
Thank you. Matthew, would you like, I'll just share the screen, shall I?
Yes, please. Good morning, everybody. Sorry, I was having IT issues too. You'd think by now would be over these things, but anyway. So we have, that's the wrong presentation, Dee.
Oh, it is too. Apologies. I'll stop sharing that one and get the right one.
So what we, mindful of time, I obviously you obviously had significant discussions about the previous matter. So what we've been asked to provide is just a very quick overview of the insurance market. What we see are the emerging risks for 2022. Have you got the right one there, Dee?
Getting there. Apologies.
Okay. So obviously we would prefer to do this in person, but current climate dictates that we can't. So please feel free to ask any questions as we go. Most of the information you will see is largely generic, although there are a few comments which are council specific, not necessarily Western Bay specific, but council sector specific. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Deanna. So as I say, we'll talk about current market conditions and then a very brief overview of the renewal outcomes. We are finalising a large report to be provided to the council staff in terms of the full breakdown of all these outcomes and various factors that were involved. So we will be providing that shortly. And then we'll touch on some of the emerging risks. Now, this presentation was put together about a month ago. and the emerging risks have changed a little in that time. And I heard on the previous presentation there was some reference to geopolitical issues going on globally. So we are in a slight state of flux on some of these things. To discuss the market at the end of Q4 last year, your insurance program is due 1 November to 1 November. So this is the relevant period for when we did the renewal. And a lot of this stuff is self-evident in conversations you've just been having. Business climate's never been more complex or connected. We are a global environment. I think everybody accepts and understands that. Our business models, whether it's your business model or Aon's business model or whoever's, are changing rapidly. And we're seeing a host of new risks, whether they be cyber or supply chain. And supply chain is particularly prevalent at the moment. The insurance markets at the time were still, we have been in a hard market cycle for about the last 3 to 5 years, which basically means that premiums and terms have been, premiums have been increasing and terms and conditions have become slightly more restrictive. Insurers have been careful as to where they are putting their capital and asking for a lot of information to allow them to make those decisions as to where to put the capital. What we have seen recently is a huge increase in cyber-related events. And of the markets that we were dealing with in 2021 at the end of Q4, cyber was probably the hardest market. Insurers are looking very carefully at minimum security protocols. They are looking very carefully at how entities are handling end-of-life software programs. I have to say, I'm not an IT expert. There are people within Aon who can have better conversations with you about this, but the market is very restrictive, pricing increases. Yeah, it's just a difficult market, that one. The other major factor in driving pricing in the property sector has been the increase in frequency and cost of natural disasters, and whether that's climate change, global warming, whatever it may be, we have seen significant increases in the frequency and severity of those events. Coincidentally, the first presentation that Deanna had put up, we have a whole raft of examples in there, but we're not using that one today because we are time constrained. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Deanna. Just as an example of what we've seen in New Zealand. Now, bearing in mind we play in a global market space, so most of your insurance policies either have a direct link to a global market or through a parent company of an insurer, they have access to the global market. So this is driven by global events, but we mustn't forget that New Zealand has also suffered its own number of weather-related events largely. As you can see from that list, we have various flooding events, South Auckland tornado back in 2019. Now, the numbers that are shown here are from the Insurance Council of New Zealand, their total cost. This isn't just commercial losses, this is also including domestic losses. So the West Auckland flooding, for example, that was quite a significant domestic event as well as a commercial event. But we have seen an increase in the frequency of these and also the dollar value of these. That's just there painting a picture of what we're seeing. Is there any questions on any of this so far?
I think carry on, Matthew.
Okay, thank you. Right, if we could go to the next slide. So you obviously have copies of this presentation, so I'm not going to go through each individual component of this because of time, but what we are seeing moving forwards is in the property market, we think we're getting to the top of the hill. We are starting to see rating increases slow down. We have seen additional capacity come into the market at the beginning of the year. And I wouldn't say we're going into the point of the market going into pricing reductions, but we are certainly seeing a stabilization of pricing and also more capacity. Now, we would hope that when you get the more capacity, you are getting into supply and demand issues that might start to drive the reduction in pricing in the commercial sector. It will not go into the free fall that we had 6 years ago, where you were talking about 30% reductions year on year. That's just not going to happen. We might see a slow, gradual -5, -10 sort of scenario. The liability section there refers to primarily the biggest exposure for local authorities is under the professional indemnity cover. That, again, a broad brush definition, relates to work that you're doing in the consenting space. Largely, there are other exposures, but predominantly it's building controls, building consenting, that sort of stuff. We have seen a slowing of the number of claims coming through from the council sector. However, they are still there. A year ago, your insurers needed an adjustment to the pricing. It was basically too cheap to be sustainable. So there was quite a significant increase in pricing. That has slowed down now. They've done the correction that was required, and we were able to get another market involved in the program. So that program is now written by 3 insurers. That is a strategic play in order to maintain the long-term integrity of that placement. There's a question from Mr. Maloney.
Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks, Matthew, and thanks, through the chair. Just could you expand on the challenges around cyber, particularly, what cover is council actually buying, and are the exclusions under that policy getting wider?
Do you want me to answer that, Lizzie?
Yes, Deanna, do you want to?
Sure. At the moment, because of the LAS arrangement and the inter-LAS processes that you've got a shared system throughout BOCLAS itself. The cover is set for all of the councils, and it is shared across all of them with a $7.5 million aggregate limit. So if there's an event that will hit maybe 2 or 3 councils, that limit gets eroded down. But you've got a $1 million limit per council. There's a $100,000 deductible on that policy per council. At the moment, we're working through, we actually have a BOCLAS Group Cyber IT's Manager Workshop on the 24th of March, which we're including all the insurance people in as well. And we're going to be talking with them about how to prepare for next renewal. Because the cyber market is so difficult at the moment, we're trying to make sure we've got the best case forward and doing a really top-notch submission. Because last year we had the issue where the declarations were completed, but they didn't understand the levity of it, if you like. So we had to do an in-depth report to make sure that we got all the correct answers. And the insurer that we have got working with us at the moment is staying with the program. They said they're quite happy to be there, but it is making sure that we understand that we meet every one of the criteria. There are 7 basic criteria that the councils need to meet. Western Bay are doing very well in this space. The main issue that we have is making sure that the insurer understands where the firewalls are, that the inter-LAS system is not going to have issues if one council has an issue, it's not going to break through and interfere with the other councils in that inter-LAS system. So that's the main issue at the moment, but we're working through that.
The reason the market has gone where it's gone is increase in frequency and cost of claims. The cyber insurance is about something being a fortuity. So it's something that may happen. And with the increase globally of cyber attacks, the increase in ransomware demands, it is almost becoming an event which is not a fortuity. It's becoming a question of when, not if. We've seen a few high-profile cases in New Zealand. My wife works at the local Waikato DHB. They had some significant issues. We have another slide which we've put up in separate presentations. Globally, there is a skewing towards government agencies, whether that be a local government or a central government agency, being targeted. So it's not necessarily random, and there has been an increase in the number of events globally. And all the points that Deanna mentioned about the levels of security within an organisation, the multi-factor authentication, all those sort of things, which, as I say, I'm not a cyber expert, but that's why we're having these conversations.
Does that answer your question, Mark?
Okay, thanks, Deanna, and thanks, Matthew.
Okay. We talk about some other, under the other line section, we talk about some other covers. Directors and officers isn't actually a huge council exposure per se, unless you've got CCOs. So we'll sort of park that one for the minute. Motor is largely claims driven. If you have a good claims outturn and if you're performing well, then the premiums reflect that. The other mentioned covers there, aviation, construction, insurance, and marine hull. They are all relatively low spend anyway, in terms of your program. And the rates there are flattish, I think is the best way of describing them. Those markets aren't quite so distressed. I did reference, not that it's a council exposure, but just how quickly things can change, which is why this is always a little hard to do in predicting markets. If you take the marine hull, I've received an email this morning from an insurer advising they're going to be putting the war and strikes clause onto various marine sendings. So anything going anywhere near Russia, that part of the world, they are restricting the cover available. But that's the standard response. That's not unusual. It's not something that affects council, but that's just how quickly those things can change with the current geopolitical climate. Could we go to the next slide? So this is, again, a little bit more information. We've covered most of this off in the narrative already. Extreme weather events globally, about US $130 billion. They've pushed the claims up in the property space. Pricing, we're looking now that we're expecting it to be single-digit increases and or flat. Probably the biggest takeaway from this particular slide is the underwriting. We used to say that underwriting was 30% science, 70% gut feel, intuition from the underwriter. That's actually changed. It's probably about 80% science now and maybe 20% intuition from the underwriter. Data is going to be absolutely fundamental in getting the best terms for you. Now, you as a council are actually quite good at this, but I mentioned earlier on there was more capacity and capital coming into the market. Well, you and thousands of other organisations will be chasing that capital. So what can we do to distinguish you from those other people chasing the capital? And it comes down to good, high quality data on property schedules and various other pieces of information. Again, I could go into that in a lot more detail, and I won't for the purposes of this. This is conversations we're having with the council staff. Could we go to the next one? Again, liability. We're seeing an increase in actions in New Zealand. I've been in New Zealand for about 16 years. I have seen in that time an increase in litigation. Somebody is always responsible. Unfortunately, councils are viewed as having a bottomless pit of money and ultimately being responsible. There's another question there.
Yeah, just on the last point you made, good high quality data. Are you, and with reference to councils, are you really referring to the valuation of council assets rather than maybe house values?
Yes, there's two components to it. It's accurate valuations. I was going to mention that at the end, but I'll talk about it now. So there's accurate valuations, And what we mean by accurate is, are they representative of the replacement cost for the asset concerned, or have you gone through a process and decided that you don't want to insure that asset for its full replacement cost, but you want to insure it for, say, a functional replacement or indemnity value only? The London markets especially they have been stung on a number of occasions. There's a current large claim going through in Australia, which I don't have any details of myself, not for a local authority, but a commercial entity. We understand that the value declared on that particular entity's schedule versus the total value of the loss, I understand it's a fire loss, is out by millions and millions of dollars. Now, that is an issue for underwriters. Underwriters, by their very nature, are conservative. If they don't have faith or understand what's in front of them, they will probably charge for it. So the more accurate the valuations, the more accurate the description of the property, the more accurate the details relating to fire protection, security protections, occupation, these basic fundamental underwriting things from a property point of view, then the better the engagement is with the underwriters and the more trust they have in that data. And that's something we do in conjunction with the insurance team at Western Bay to extract all that information and highlight where those things may need to be tweaked or looked at in preparation for the next renewal.
Thank you.
Okay. Can we go to the next slide, Deanna? Mindful of time, please. You buy a crime fidelity policy. We are seeing increase in pricing in that. Again, the premium spend is not huge in relative terms. They are generic market comments around that. It's bundled under the liability package, as it were, from an underwriting point of view. So we are seeing some increase in pricing on that. Again, we are hoping that that particular sector will start to slow down in 2022. Next one, Dean. Cyber, well, we've actually covered most of this off in the conversations already. Very tough market. Insurers are reducing capacity. You're seeing things like a 50% co-insurer clause being applied by some insurers, which means that, yes, the insurer may give you $1 million worth of limit. This isn't relevant to council. This is just a market comment. They may give you $1 million worth of limit, but they'll look to you to supply 50% of that. So in essence, you've got $500,000. That's not what we have with your insurers. That's all the good work that's been done by Deanna and the Botplas group to have those conversations with the underwriters and the continued work we're doing. But that's just one example of how this market is rapidly contracting. Next one, please, Dee. So to the point that was raised earlier about valuations, one of the things to consider is, do you want to insure everything? Now, we are very aware that in the past few years, you've seen rating increases sort of plus 15, plus 20, plus 25. That year on year on year on year is not necessarily sustainable when you also have an increase in values. So are we at a point where we need to have conversations with the organisation about what is its appetite to risk? What's its risk retention policy? Do we look at alternative methods? If you want to cap an insurance spend, then you still have those exposures, but they need to be dealt with in some other manner within the organisation. So this is all about balance sheet capability, understanding the risk, and is insurance a continued cost-effective risk transfer mechanism? So these, again, are conversations that we are having at the Botplas level, and we will be suggesting some potential options as to how that can be handled, but there does have to be cost benefit to council for that to be considered. But we are looking at different ways of doing it. Next slide, please, Deanna. So this is just a summary of the actual premium outcomes 2020 to 2021. My head into gear that we're 2022 now. So these are just the premiums. There are no levies or anything associated with these. We will, as I said earlier, be providing a full report which breaks down each sector, each cover. What does need to be borne in mind, especially with the material damage and infrastructure, is an underlying increase in the total declared values. If you look at those numbers in isolation, the premium increases are significant. However, if you take the material damage and business interruption, for example, there was about a 50% increase in the total declared values that underpin those numbers. So the actual rating increase, and I've just done some round numbers this morning, it's about a 50% increase in the total declared values. That premium increase is about 35%. That means the actual underlying rate was about a plus 15%. So that is in line with where we saw the market at the end of Q4 2020. We're hoping, as I say, that that will slow down. Most of the policies, and the same comment, sorry, can be made for the infrastructure. There was an increase in the declared values on that as well. Most of the other classes, with the exception of the professional indemnity, were largely, sorry, professional indemnity and cyber were largely flat. And again, the professional indemnity increase is a combination of increasing council's revenue versus an underlying rate increase. But that's just a snapshot.
Matthew, I have Mark Dean who's got his hand up. So, Mark.
Yes. Why have we got aviation hull and aviation non-owners? We don't own any aeroplanes. What's going on there? And also, the 2022 the premium for aviation non-owners at $1.80, is it? No, or it's been, there's a figure missing there, be 1,800.
Oh, there is two. Sorry, that's my mistake. The aviation hull I am picking, I would have to go and check. The aviation hull I'm picking is a drone. So what you have there is a lot of councils actually have started to use drones, and they are, the liability attached with operating that drone is excluded under the general liability policy. A general liability policy does not include, for want of a better term, aviation risks. So in order to get that third party cover, as well as insuring the drone, then you do the aviation hull. It will be a drone.
Right, thank you.
And yes, there is a typo in there. Sorry, it's my mistake. Next slide, please, Steve, if there's no other questions. So what are the emerging risks? We've sort of spoken about most of these already. I would add a couple, literally, as I say, this was done a month ago. Climate change, that's the increase in flooding events, that's the increase in exposures, both from a property point of view, but also from your liability point of view. How are you as an organisation handling the climate change impacts in the building consenting process, all of those sort of things. This subject has been covered ad nauseum, I think, with most councils, so I would expect you've got a good handle on that. Corporate social responsibility in environmental social governance, those sort of things. We have seen, now this I would hope is not a council issue, we have seen some insurers walk away from clients who are involved in fossil fuels. So big insurer in Europe basically just said, no, we don't want to write anybody involved in fossil fuels. So not really an exposure for council per se, but it is just something we need to be mindful of. The disruptive technologies is largely all around cyber issues and things that are going on in that space. Personal liability, we talk about D&O, that only really applies to any CCOs the council may have. And the one that I would add into this now from when this was done is supply chain issues. I don't think we can underestimate the potential impact that is going to have on A, your ability to construct projects, and B, the cost of constructing those projects or doing those works. Getting a builder to do something is hard work at the moment. We're seeing a scarcity of Gibboard, from what I understand. I don't know how apocryphal that story is, but I've seen, you see those things in the press. If you then add to that the uncertainty of pricing of materials, previous presenter was talking about global oil prices. All these things are going to have an impact potentially on the manufacturing sector globally. And what is that going to do to the cost of materials, the supply of materials? And then you add in the geopolitical issues that we've got currently. That needs to be kept an eye on, so that we're aware of where that goes. We have a valuations team, and they're talking about inflation factors on building projects, sort of 20% inflationary factors on some of these building projects. These are significant numbers that we need to make sure we're not caught out with at any stage in the future. I think that's the last slide, isn't it, Dee? Yep. So that is a very high level overview. There are about 4 or 5 other presentations we have that come off of this and cover various topics. If you want us to, we're happy to talk to you about those in more detail. I don't want to overstay our welcome, so I'm very mindful of time.
Well, thank you, Matthew. That's been a really great presentation, and thank you and Deanna for that. I do have, there's one last question, I think, from Councillor Daly, so maybe you can answer his question.
Yeah, just quickly on cyber, I'm just wondering what the response is. Does paying the ransom get the data back? Are companies having to pay to restore the data? And do you recommend a preferred methodology to your client?
Yes, through the policy, there is a company that is available to yourselves to be able to help with that, and they go through and work with ensuring that you've got, you're able to, whether or not you pay the ransomware, depending on the level of what they're asking for and what's exposed, they will go through with reputational damage to help combat that. So there's a whole process that they go through and work with you. As soon as you notify ourselves that there is an issue, then we're able to contact the insurer and the third party to be able to assist with this.
The other issue to this, and that's 100% correct in terms of what Dee's advising about policy response, I'd turn that question around. What is your, and I'm not trying to be argumentative, but you'll see where I'm going with this. What is your attitude towards that as an organisation? Now, again, I'm not sure if this is 100% correct, but I think you'll find that central government probably don't pay ransoms if there is a ransomware. You might find that DHBs don't pay ransoms if there's a ransomware. They deal with the problem. You may find that smaller commercial entities who are not constrained by some of those things will pay ransoms through the insurance to get their data back. And I have experience of one company who about 2 years ago had that happen to them. This is not a local government sector, this is a private company. They paid the ransomware and they got a thank you email back and the passcode for all of their data so they could get back up and running again. And I naively asked the question at the time, why would you pay the ransomware? How do you know you're going to get your stuff back? And the person who was dealing with it at that time, this is 2-3 years ago, so this may be out of date in terms of a response to these people, but the response I got back then was, well, their business model doesn't work if they don't give you the data back because nobody's going to pay the ransom. And if you think about that, it makes perfect sense. That is old information, but I think the bigger question is perhaps what is your attitude as an organisation to dealing with that? And I don't know if there's any constraints put out by central government, local government act, or all sorts of things that may be applicable.
Part of the cyber declaration, they ask about your business continuity plan, your incident response plans in the event that something like this happens. So as an organisation, there should be these things in place so that you know what you're going to do if you're hit by a cyber event.
Just one last thing. I guess the insurance company isn't prepared to pay a ransom.
No, there is cover under the policy for ransomware. So, sorry, for the ransom. That's part of what you have cover for under the program. So that small company that I mentioned earlier who had this attack 2 years ago, their insurers paid X $1,000 as part of a policy response. But that is where we have seen the cyber market constrict, in that some insurers are now saying, right, we'll give you ransomware cover, but we expect you to contribute 50% towards it. So it's a very moving feast at the moment, unfortunately. But in principle, that's one of the key components of cover that you get under the cyber policy.
Thank you, Matthew. I think we're at the end of the questions now. So thank you again. We have 2 recommendations. So I'll call for a mover and seconder, please. Stick your hand up, someone. Councillor Daly, Councillor Henry. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried.
Aye.
Thank you very much. And so we'll now move on to page 9 and the summary of audit and risk agenda topics. And James, are you leading this one?
Yes, that's correct. Morena councillors. Obviously, this is just a summary paper of all the other papers. So in the interest of time, with our workshop coming up later on, I'd move this paper, take this paper as read and just take any questions.
Thank you. We've got the auditors from Audit New Zealand here, so that they've got their report there. So I'm guessing there'll be some questions on that possibly. Warren, I can see you're on. Did you want to say anything about your audit report?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Leon Peterson, and I'm your appointed auditor, replacing Clarence, who had to rotate off the audit after 6 years in accordance to our independence rules. A little bit about me. I've been auditing local authorities for 14 years, which is also how long I've been in New Zealand and with Audit New Zealand. You probably didn't pick up from my accent that I'm not a born and bred Kiwi. I'm really looking forward to working with you and continue the good working relationship you have with Audit New Zealand. Also joining us is Warren Goslet, who's been the audit manager last year as well. He can help answer any detailed questions you may have on our, or should I say, Clarence's report. I know your agenda is really full, so I'll take the report as read and not go into details. Just referring you to a few pages on your agenda items. On your page 14 are the key messages from last year's audit. On pages 15 and 16 of your agenda, we have some new recommendations. Most relate to property, plant and equipment, including revaluations, remaining lives of assets, asset capitalization, disposal of assets. And we've also commented in the report on what we've done during the audit on the issues raised in our audit plan. And apart from the recommendations mentioned, we didn't find any significant issues to discuss. I think I've said enough, so take any questions.
Thank you, Leon. It's lovely to meet you and welcome you as our new auditor. I did have a question about the, you mentioned about the property, plant and equipment and so on. And most of the new recommendations relate to revaluation, capitalisation, vesting and depreciation of those assets. And I was just wondering, does that reflect a particular focus of Audit New Zealand for this audit, or does it represent a systemic issue in how aspects of asset management have been handled by staff?
In my opinion, seeing that I wasn't on the audit, so I'll give Warren a chance to talk to this as well. But we've seen it across all local authorities because property, plant and equipment makes up such a huge balance on your balance sheet that it's definitely an area of focus. Also, we've been recommending improvement of asset data over a long period of time. And we're seeing that coming through now. Unfortunately, it sometimes means prior year errors and so forth. but it's a good thing because as the data just keep on improving. Warren, you want to add something?
I will. Thanks, Leon and Mr. Chair. Just to add that with property, plant and equipment, the reason why we're having to delve a little bit deeper is because it's an area on the balance sheet that does come with judgments and assumptions, especially in the revaluation space. So there has been guidance and more focus, guidance issued and more focus on those aspects.
Thank you. Member Maloney.
Thank you for the chair, and welcome Leon and Warren. Good to see you again, Leon. Look, it's a similar question actually, but it's more directed at management, to James and David. As the chair noted, there are a number of items in the report, that go to property, plant and equipment. And thanks, Leon and Warren, for the explanation as to the focus on those. But really a question particularly for James, with a fresh set of eyes. Is there anything that's causing management concern with those recommendations? And I do note in a later report, in terms of status of recommendations, I see there is a plan in place to respond to all of these recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, at this stage, Mark, I mean, it was an unmodified opinion. There was in the actions, there's no urgent actions there. There's a lot of recommendations and best practice. And obviously with the fact that we revalued all the assets this current audit year, that's raised a whole lot of issues. So at this stage, no, I wouldn't have any major concerns.
Thank you, James.
Councillor Dean.
I'm concerned about item 4.3 in your report, undeclared interests. I got questioned late last year about my involvement in a trust. That involvement in a trust actually ended in 2009. And I wonder where you got your information from that I was still involved in that trust. In fact, I think there were 2 trusts involved. How sound is your researching of this sort of information? Who audits the auditors?
So to answer your question, Councillor Dean, that piece of work was an assessment performed by Audit New Zealand, who would have had they would have led a conversation with you around any involvement you may have had with trusts that they felt weren't in the register. It would have been at that time that a conversation probably should have taken place if you felt that it wasn't warranted. However, if that hasn't taken place, we can rectify that in the upcoming audit to make sure that the interest register matches the agreed position.
But my point is, so that I wasn't a councillor in 2009. I was elected to council in 2016, where I declared my interests, which were actually recorded in the company's files, and it should not have been even raised by the audit.
Did you have any perhaps feedback to Sheena on this particular audit issue? It's not something I've.
Yes. So what we noticed was Warren had sent us a list of all the conflicts of interest that were not declared. And some of it were actually not declared, but some of it, like you're saying, was already closed. So we sent back Warren the file of all the declared interests, and that comment is now being closed. But some of it were, I think, already closed, but they did point it out, and we did mention it to Warren.
To summarise there, Councillor Dean, it's a reminder for everyone of the importance of declaring. Of being mindful of the way we declare interest, and if a interest has been erroneously included, we can make sure that it's treated in the upcoming audit.
Yeah, and we'll work closely with management on this one, Councillor Dean. Just that we don't have anything in our report that's not factually accurate. So I unfortunately can't comment on last year, but I know we've got really robust processes around this area.
Thank you. Councillor Henry.
Yes, I wasn't going to raise a conflict of interest, but conflict of interest is raised during the meeting process. But many of these things go out to long-term planner in the budget, that many communities have councillors that are on their committees. So, I mean, do we actually have to go that far to put conflict of interest into the long-term plan that goes out, where our community interests are actually receiving money from council for things like maintenance of, well, in my case, maintenance of murals that are in the community that I'm on the committee of the group that maintains that? That's the first question. I have another two.
I think it's important to be mindful of what this piece of work is actually asking elected members to do. It's not to raise a conflict of interest, it's to declare any interest that may exist. So it's not to say you're conflicted, it's just to record any interests you may have, whether you're on it's more for what this particular order item is asking you to do, is just to declare up front any pecuniary or non-pecuniary may have.
The fact that we've actually declared that, written it down and given you, is sufficient. Is that what you're saying?
And can I just jump in there? I think it's really, really important that we register all of our interests. As David was saying, they're interests, they're not conflicts. So it's just actually giving a record of what other organisations or other activities people are involved with, to be clean. And then if we can foresee any conflict coming up through any papers that we might, we might see a link or something like that, it only actually becomes a conflict under the Code of Conduct where there's some sort of pecuniary advantage to a councillor, a financial advantage in some way. It's the only time it becomes actually a conflict. So, but it's just really good practice to capture all of the interests. So that we can foreshadow any conflicts.
Well, unfortunately, my work in the community doesn't give me any pecuniary interest.
Sure. But it's also it's also a good look in terms of reputation, right? We have a lot of people saying things like, "Oh, this person's involved in this and that," and it's impossible to avoid in New Zealand, isn't it?
Oh, no, especially in small communities, and especially in New Zealand. Anyway, the other thing that I want to, and I'm sure this is what it is, I just want to check with you, and I'm sorry, I thought that I wasn't going to get a phone call while I was on here. The vested assets that require the certificate 224, are they through subdivisions like getting an Esplanade Reserve and things like that? Are those the sorts of things you're talking about?
Those could be a reserve, a road, a pipe, something that a developer has built when they're doing a subdivision that they are giving to council to maintain. It's the mechanism where they give us those assets to maintain.
Yeah, and I guess that you're fixing up the internals to actually pick that up when it's supposed to be, when it comes into use in council. And that's an internal thing, so I guess that's yes. One of the things that John had highlighted was the customer service and that dry whatever, where the sewage flow overflows. I was interested to read that with the I can't remember how it went, the 15 service requests, and then 16 of them were picked up but were actually recorded wrongly because of the way the customer had delivered them, and when the contractor went, that they found that they should have been notified. I suppose, I don't know whether that was what it was, but that's when we're dealing with an outside the contractor. So how is that going to be picked up? So those sorts of things, and I don't know whether that happens in other areas, are picked up correctly.
So since for example, when a customer calls and they report an incident, they don't know actually what is really wrong. So when the independent contractor goes to the site, he knows what is actually wrong, and therefore there's a slight mismatch. But now, because of the Three Waters transition, we are working closely with Tauranga City Council and their contractor to get what DIA actually classifies as a dry water overflow, sewerage overflow. So they're working on it to see what Audit New Zealand wants, and even Audit New Zealand is meeting with them, I guess. So that we're all on the same page.
Yeah, so you'll get that back from the contractor then, so you don't get the wrong recording through your consumer.
Correct. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're just about out of questions, but I had one more for the meeting. Because I noted the 5 suggested questions for management on changes to the procurement rules. I'm just wondering if management would like to answer these now. This is on page 30.
Yeah, I can do a quick one on that, James, if you like.
Yep.
Sorry, Councillor Denia. Yes, so currently at the moment, our procurement policy and procedures follows the New Zealand government procurement guidelines. So we're in compliance with that. Obviously, this is new kind of recommendations and the likes. We are due to renew our policy this year, our procurement policy and procedures, by June 2022. And we are currently working with an external body to figure out how we integrate the iwi representation in terms of tender policy and meet those particular KPIs where appropriate.
Thank you. And perhaps a follow-up one for Leon would be, perhaps the most pertinent question right now is what Audit New Zealand views as the audit implications for council as a mandated agency, but one that is merely encouraged to follow the rules rather than expected to follow the rules or required to follow the rules.
That's a really good question, Jay. And our view is this is an improvement area that we suggest or recommend. We don't see this going to be an impact on the audit opinion as such, because it's all about procurement and improvement in that area across the public sector.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think we're out of questions. So I'll call for a mover and seconder for the receiving that report. Councillor Henry and Councillor Sol. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 Against? Carried. Thank you very much. And thank you, Warren and Leon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So moving on to page 43, Treasury Update Report. David, the floor is yours.
For this Treasury report, I believe we've probably covered a lot of technical information on the concept of Treasury already this morning. I think just to speak on this report is to reiterate that our council staff meet with Bancorp on a monthly basis to make sure our Treasury function and our risk is well managed. And we undertake monthly assessments of our risk, and we currently believe our risk is low. I'm happy to take questions on the report. Otherwise, I'll take the contents as read.
Okay, I don't see any questions. So I'll move that we receive the report and look for a seconder. Who's going to do that? I'll see now. Councillor Dean, thank you very much. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Okay, so page 45, quarterly review of risk. I'll let Tashina cover this, but I suspect we're going to do more in a workshop. So I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, so I also take it you all have read the report. The main thing is usually you would have seen a strategic risk register, but this time we felt that we want to take you all along the journey with us. So that's why we are having the risk workshop presented by KPMG. So even I'm looking forward to that. So if you all have any other questions on the report, please ask.
Yeah, I think one thing also just to mention, you're seeing the first item on the executive summary is regarding Mark Maloney, member Maloney, and he resigned after this meeting. So Mark, would you like to just give a little bit of context to that decision?
Thank you, Improver Chair. As the Chair has alluded to, I am in the unfortunate position of having to step down because of a conflict of interest that wasn't foreseen when I took on the role. I'm about to take up a position middle of April as the Assistant Auditor General Local Government for the Office of the Auditor General. So unfortunately, it places me in the difficult position. I can't be both effectively representing your auditor, leading the audit strategies for local government in New Zealand, and sitting on your Audit and Risk Committee. And It is with a somewhat mixed emotions. It wasn't foreseen when I took on the role, but I know management had a plan in place to replace me as an independent member, and I'll leave it to management to update you. But the good news story is I'll be continuing to work with council, but sitting on the other side of the table moving forward. So.
Thank you, Mark. You'll be missed, and we'll just take this opportunity to thank you for your contributions to this committee, and wish you well in Audit New Zealand, as in the Office of Auditor General. Yeah.
Look, thank you through the chair, and a thank you to the committee, and thank you to the chief executive and management.
Okay, if there's no questions, I'll call for a mover and seconder for the two recommendations there. Councillor Henry and Councillor Murray-Benge. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Against, carried. Thank you, Tina. And I think you're on for the next one as well. Page 48, the update on outstanding audit items.
Yes. Do you all have any questions regarding that, councillors?
I'll give a quick moment for the members to read through the report. Okay, it doesn't look like there are any questions, so I shall call for a mover and a second on that one. Okay. Councillor Granger, Councillor Dean, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, carried. So now item 9.5, Health and Safety Report on page 63. Have we got Lauren online? Lauren, are you there?
Total silence from management. James, let's take the report as read and see if we've got any questions, eh?
I think so. I did actually have one question on that one, and that was regarding the aggressive customers at Te Puke Library. And I just wanted to know, that was about the vaccine mandate issues. And I was just wondering if they were sort of an organic situation or whether it was a sort of contrived situation where they're just doing that as a protest. I know that has upset some staff or volunteers in Kadikadi and other organisations when that happened. So I just wondered how it occurred in Te Puke.
So, Councillor Denia, we're happy to come back to you on that with some more detail if you'd like, but I think our understanding is at this stage, being kind of broadly across this, is it's more of a frustration thing. It's not an organised campaign or the likes. It's more about there's a lot of anxiety going on in the community at the moment. I think it's just, I also think, and I'm speculating here, it's wider than just certain issues. It's also around, as we've seen from Bancorp and the like, cost of livings and things like that. So there's a general level of angst and frustration, and I think this is just all adding up, and for some people it's probably a bit too much.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Granger. You're still on mute.
No.
You're okay now.
Hi. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's health and safety is probably the appropriate point to raise the letter that I sent into CEO about a question of any exposure that Western Bay may have to lawsuits from staff forced to resign or forced to take an unwarranted medical procedure in order to keep their jobs as a result of the COVID mandate vaccine policy, especially since that has been ruled unlawful in the case with the police and Defence Force Services case. So do we have exposure there, and how are we mitigating that?
Councillor Granger, we're going to cover that in the confidential section. So if you just hold your horses on that one, and then we'll cover it in just a moment. Okay. Okay, so if there's no Oh no, Mayor Webber.
Yeah, thanks, James. I suppose a more appropriate question to the Chief Executive is, given what we've seen through the COVID exercise, are you comfortable that we've learned enough lessons that we've got an appropriate business continuity plan in place, or we're working on it? Because this is an incredibly unusual circumstance, and what are the learnings we've got from it? Thank you.
Sure, Mayor Webber. I think we've got really good plans in place around resilience and continuity. And, we've been since October, November last year, when I can't remember what colour we were then, but we've been splitting our teams, and particularly those in the more essential services around free waters, etc. Those more critical services that we have. So we're trying to limit exposure across teams, which has seemed to have worked really well. What I will say is that through the measures that we've put in place, while numbers are really high around the country, and we've got our own number of cases within our organisation, not one of our cases has been spread from one of our staff members to another staff member. So it's all actually, I'd say most of the cases at the moment are coming up through schools and to the parents who work for us. So business continuity wise is good. Our true risk, where our most critical risk is always going to sit in the water operations area. We have got a few of those staff out at the moment, either with COVID or close household contacts. What we did leading up to this was to train additional staff in Gary's space to be able to cater for that. So we're looking at deploying some of those crossover staff, for lack of a better word.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we're out of questions now. Just checking the list. No, we're good. So I'll call for a mover and seconder on the health and safety report. And would like to put the hand up. Councillor Henry, Councillor Sol. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. So there's no information for receipt, and now we'll just move into the confidential section. So we'll call for a mover and seconder to exclude the public. I'll move that then, and Councillor Granger, you'll second that. All those in favour, please.